Paul is a really good teacher. So in Romans 3:21-31, he has given us a condensed version of what the gospel means and what salvation looks like. He's given us three views saying that it means redemption, propitiation, and justification. And then he emphasizes that all of this comes by faith. And so if faith is the only thing that I have to do, my next question is, well, then what is faith? Like, if that's the only thing required of me, I want to make sure I get it right. I want to make sure I do it the right way. And so Paul has just given this huge, concentrated version of the gospel, and then he answers that question. If faith is the only thing that we put in, then we need to know what that looks like. And like a good teacher, he gives us an example. And so he gives us the example of Abraham as the faith that we need to follow. So if you would take just a minute and read through Romans chapter 4 so that you're familiar with the passage as we go through it. So you can pause the video and then come back to us once you've read that passage. Okay, so hopefully at this point you've read Romans 4 and seen that Paul uses faith of Abraham as an example of the faith that we should have in the first part of chapter 4. And then in the second part of chapter 4, he describes now, then this is what this means for us. So this is how he explains faith. He gives us the example of Abraham, and then he touches on David just a little bit. He said faith is credited to the believer. And this is really important. If there is a key phrase in all of chapter 4, it's Abraham believed God and it was credited to him as righteousness. And so this idea of him believing is what's credited as righteousness. And so faith is what's credited to the believer, and then his sin is not debited against him. And so I want to use this idea of crediting and debiting using a bank ledger or a bank account to kind of describe what Paul is saying here in Romans chapter 4. And I'm taking this idea of we are credited with the righteousness of Christ and our sin is not debited against us from 2 Corinthians 5:21. God made him who knew no sin to be sin for us, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God. So when God looks at us, he sees the righteousness of God. And so I want to use this with a very simple example of crediting and debiting from a bank ledger. Now, I faithfully saw my mom every single month balance her checkbook. And so she would pull out her ledger from her checkbook and she would look at every time she had put any money in or any money out of her account, and she would balance that with the bank statement from the bank to make sure that the money that's in the bank is what she has recorded. And so my mom faithfully recorded every time she spent money, and I saw this my entire childhood. Nowadays we don't use this very often as everything is accessible online, but still it uses a really good illustration for us today. So if you were to do this with a normal bank ledger, every amount that you put in is called a credit. You get a credit into your account. And so your paycheck, you get paid for babysitting, you get paid for your work at Dairy Queen, and all of that goes into the crediting section. Then every time you spend money would go into the debit section. So if we're going to use this in the idea of righteousness and sin, then all of our good deeds would be put in as a credit, and all of our bad deeds would be pulled out as a debit. Unfortunately, the Bible has made it very clear in Romans 3:10, it says there is no one righteous, not even one, and then it describes that we are from head to toe sinful. And so if we were to look at this from an everyday kind of perspective, the amount of bad works that we do far, 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 far outweigh the amount of good works that we can do. In fact, we all fall short of the glory of God, taken from Romans 3:23. And so if we were to take an account of every single good deed and bad deed that we did throughout the day, on a normal, everyday kind of day, we would have beyond more sin than we would righteousness. We would have way more debits against our account than we would credits. So now if we put this into a spiritual perspective of what it means to have faith, let's say that we owed God a huge amount of money that you could never pay off. To just make it even numbers, let's say we owed God $1 million. Our sin against him cost $1 million in debits, and so we are $1 million in the red. And so what happens then is that we owe God that huge debt, and every day that we live, we sin even more, and so our debt increases all the more. But what Christ has done is he's given us redemption through his blood. And so Christ has access to our bank account, and in our bank account, he has put in his own blood, therefore paying off our debt. Now, the amazing thing is that if we were in debt $1 million, we would be considered quite poor, and yet Christ pays that debt off. But if he left us that way, he left us at zero, we would still be quite poor. But instead, what Christ does is he puts into our bank account his very own righteousness. He puts in his righteousness on top of the redemption that he's already put in. And so he not only pays off our debt, putting our account at zero, but he puts in his own righteousness. So if we were to say that was worth $1 million, now in our bank account is not negative $1 million, but positive $1 million. And so when God looks at our bank account, he doesn't see someone who's in the red. He doesn't see someone who's indebted. He sees someone who is righteous. He sees someone who has the very righteousness of God, according to 2 Corinthians 5:21. Now, though, if we weren't aware of this, or if we didn't believe it, then the money would sit there in our account unused, unaccessed. And so what we do is we put our faith into the account. We believe it to be true. And so we go to the store and we swipe our debit card, knowing that the money has been put in there, knowing that the righteousness of Christ has been put in. So we believe it to be true. In order to have access to that money that he's put in there, we believe it. So I hope this is an illustration of what this faith looks like. It's something Christ has already done. He has already paid off our debt, and he has already given us the righteousness, his very own righteousness for ourselves. But we access that as we believe it to be true. Now, Paul reveals several truths about what faith does or doesn't look like in these chapters. So first, he describes Abraham. He says in verse 4, "Now to him who works, wages are not credited as an obligation. However, to the one who does not work but trusts God, he justifies the ungodly. Their faith is credited as righteousness." So first of all, we are declared righteous outside of works. We are declared righteous outside of human effort. It is the works that we do are the sin that we do, and our wage that we deserve is death. But there are no amount of good works that we can do that will get us the righteousness of Christ. We cannot save ourselves. It is outside of works. This is purely a gift of God. Next, we are declared righteous outside of human ceremony. And I want to explain what this one is. So in verses 9 through 12, Paul describes that Abraham believed God and it was credited to him as righteousness. Verse 10, under what circumstances was it credited? Was it after he was circumcised or before? It was not after, but before. And he received circumcision as a sign, a seal of the righteousness that he already had by faith, while he was still uncircumcised. So Paul is describing that Abraham's faith was made available to him before circumcision. And so it was not circumcision that saved him. It was his faith that saved him. And the circumcision was a sign or a seal of the salvation he had received. Now, we don't practice circumcision as a rite of faith or not today. It is a cultural thing that's practiced or not. It's not, as it was for the Jews, what declares someone righteous, is what the Jews believed. But we do have other ceremonies or traditions that we often interpret as necessary for salvation. There are some groups of Christians that would say baptism is one of those ceremonies or traditions, that people need to be baptized in order to be saved. But I think if Paul were standing right here today, he would agree with this truth. Baptism does not save you. It is faith that saves you. Baptism is a sign and seal of the salvation you've already received by faith. Just as circumcision was a sign and seal for Abraham of the salvation he had received, so baptism is a sign and seal of the salvation we have already received by faith. I have heard of other denominations that say speaking in tongues or being slain in the Spirit is a requirement for salvation. But the order is really important. salvation comes first by faith through grace, not by any human ceremony. If Abraham was saved and he was credited with righteousness before he was circumcised, then certainly we are credited with righteousness before we are baptized, or before we are slain in the Spirit or receive the gift of speaking in tongues. So we are declared upright apart from human ceremony. Verses 13 and 14 reveal the third one. It is not through the law that Abraham and his offspring received the promise that he would be the heir of the world, but through the righteousness that comes by faith. We are declared righteous apart from the law. Now this one's very similar to the first one. We are declared righteous apart from works, but the difference being, when we feel like we have to be declared righteous by works, we try to do good things in order that we might be considered saved or a good person. But someone who does things apart from the law might consider that following the rules or not doing bad things is what makes them a good person, is what declares them righteous, is what brings them salvation. And so here Paul is saying, it is not the good things that you do, but it's also not the bad things that you don't do that make you a believer. It's not the list of don'ts that you don't practice. Instead, you are declared upright by faith and apart from the law. So those three, we are declared upright apart from human effort, we are declared upright apart from human ceremony, and we are declared upright apart from the law. So then, all three of those are apart froms. How is it that we are declared righteous? Number one, we are declared righteous by faith. Verse 17 says, "As it is written, I have made you a father of many nations. He is our father in the sight of God, in whom he believed, the God who gives life to the dead and calls into being things that were not. Against all hope, Abraham in hope believed, and so became the father of many nations. Just as it has been said to him, so shall your offspring be." I love this part. It says, without weakening in his faith, he faced the fact that his body was as good as dead, since he was about 100 years old, and that Sarah's womb was also dead. But he did not waver in unbelief regarding the promise of God, but was strengthened in his faith. And then verse 21 gives us a really good definition of what faith is. Abraham was fully persuaded that God had power to do what he had promised. God has promised us through the person of Jesus that we have redemption, we have salvation, we have atonement, we have justification. Through the person of Jesus and through his shed blood, we have been forgiven of our sins. God has promised that. And so what he requires of us is that we would have the same faith that Abraham had, that we would be fully persuaded that God has power to do what he has promised. We are declared upright, not by works, by ceremony, or by the law. We are declared upright by believing in the promises that God has made. And lastly, verses 22 to 25 describe that this already happened. We have already been declared upright by faith through the work of Jesus. It is something that happened when Jesus died and rose again from the dead. We were declared upright. It is faith, though, that accesses that into our account.